Hello friends, my name is JJ, and today we are going to do a little core knowledge lesson about world leaders from the early 1990s. Core knowledge is an educational philosophy that has influenced me quite a bit. It's an idea that was articulated by a guy named E.D. Hirsch, who argued that educators should prioritize teaching about the people, places, events, stories, objects, and so on that our culture generally expects and should expect most people to know. Another name for this would be background knowledge. And this is a philosophy that I try to bring to my videos. When I make an educational video about something, I always think, will learning this stuff make my audience more culturally literate? Will it make it easier for them to do stuff like read the newspaper or have conversations with other informed people or even just get the references on TV shows? So here is the real-world example that inspired this video. While visiting a library in downtown Vancouver, I came across this display of 15 portraits of 90s era world leaders painted by a Chinese-Canadian artist named Gu Sheng, and I thought that this was just a cool little selection of important men and women whose names and faces everyone should probably know. So why not do a core knowledge lesson about them? And just to keep this video fast-paced, I thought I would devote no more than 1 minute to each person. I think that's the other thing about core knowledge. If the knowledge is really all that core, it should be easy to teach why it is worth knowing relatively quickly. Ready? Ready. So first we've got Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev was the last president of the Soviet Union, and in that sense was the guy who formally embodied the end of the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, being the tension between communist countries and non-communist countries that had defined international relations since the end of World War II. Old Gorby, as they called him, came to power at a time when the Soviet economy was suffering and ill-conceived war in Afghanistan was going badly, and public disillusion with the harsh and dictatorial communist political and economic system of the country had reached a peak. Into this context came Gorby, the dynamic reformer, who promoted two ideas that he became very famous for: glasnost, or the expansion of political freedom, and perestroika, or economic liberalization. In foreign policy, he ended the practice of trying to puppeteer the affairs of the Soviet Union's neighbors, pulling out of Afghanistan and looking the other way as surrounding communist governments were overthrown. Breaking all of these taboos, however, undermined Soviet authority beyond the point of no return, and the Soviet Union formally collapsed in 1991 when all of its component states declared independence as new, non-communist countries. And no more communism meant no more Cold War. Next, we got George H.W. Bush, President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. Bush had been vice president for 8 years under Ronald Reagan, a very popular conservative president who was nevertheless constitutionally forbidden to run for a third term. But Bush was a much less dynamic figure than Reagan, always seen as coming from the more moderate establishment wing of the Republican Party, and never really enjoyed the same level of fame or popularity as his former boss, in part because he never really sought to be as dramatic of a leader. The one exception came in August of 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Then Bush enjoyed heavy praise for helping assemble a strong international military coalition to liberate Kuwait and drive Iraq out, with this so-called Persian Gulf War being something Bush was quite proud of as a symbol of America's willingness to defend a peaceful, rules-based international order among countries. But that short war was quickly forgotten, and Bush was ultimately held more accountable for an economic downturn that followed, and he was voted out in 1992. Today, we might remember the old man Bush primarily for his two sons, George Bush Jr. and Jeb Bush, both of whom ran for president as well, but only one successfully. Third, we got Deng Xiaoping, leader of the People's Republic of China from the late 1970s to 1997. Deng Xiaoping rose to power following the death of Communist China's first dictator, Mao Zedong. Deng was never actually president, however, just a kind of big boss type character, and the vague nature of his government symbolized the degree that China still had to sort out a lot of internal matters after the passing of Mao, who had been so controlling of everything. Deng's rule is usually credited for establishing the big post-Mao compromise. On the one hand, the country's communist economic system would be greatly liberalized, becoming something much more closely resembling an ordinary free market economy. But on the other, the government would still be structured as a traditional communist dictatorship, albeit not nearly one as cruel and as totalitarian as had existed under Mao. This compromise was in turn embodied by the dueling headlines that characterized the Deng years: an unprecedented economic boom one day, a hideous massacre of protesting students at Tiananmen Square the next. Deng impressed the West with his pragmatic and even cynical approach to economics, but is now often seen as a guy who seduced much of the world into a false sense that the Chinese regime had the capacity to change more than it ultimately did. Fourth, Corazon Aquino, president of the Philippines from 1986 to 1992. From the mid-1960s to the late 1980s, the Philippines was run by a dictator named Ferdinand Marcos, and Mrs. Aquino was married to the head of one of the lead Filipino opposition parties. When her husband was assassinated in 1983, she took over the leadership of the party and became an increasingly famous global symbol of resistance to what had become one of the world's most notorious dictatorships. In 1986, she ran against Marcos for the presidency and won, driving him into exile and making her an even more beloved symbol of the turn towards greater democracy in the developing world. As president, she brought in a new democratic constitution that they still use to this day. I would say that Aquino fits into a certain category of world leader that was quite popular in the 1990s, someone promising the dawn of a new age where everything would be better. But many of the deeper problems of Filipino society persisted throughout her tenure and beyond, including poverty, corruption, and domestic terrorism. This has increasingly led many Filipinos to believe that the evils of the Marcos years were exaggerated, and just recently, the son of the former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., was elected to power. Number 5, F.W. de Klerk, president of South Africa from 1989 to 1994. F.W. de Klerk was the last white president of South Africa, and the guy who ended the country's notorious apartheid system that imposed rigid racial segregation and political disenfranchisement on the country's black majority. In 1990, de Klerk's administration freed the famous civil rights leader Nelson Mandela, and then passed legislation permitting the country's first ever multiracial elections. Mandela ran against him and won. He and Mandela jointly won the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize for laying the foundations for a new democratic South Africa. Now, there was always a certain paradox inherent in de Klerk's political career. On the one hand, he instigated the policies that dismantled apartheid, but on the other hand, he was only able to do so because he was able to rise to the top of the apartheid political system. So obviously, he did believe in that system at one time. Near the end of his life, I would say that de Klerk's reputation grew steadily darker, with him considered less of a visionary leader than just the guy who happened to be in charge when the facts on the ground would have made it obvious to any president that the apartheid system was no longer sustainable. Number 6, Pope John Paul II, head of the Catholic Church from 1978 to 2005. JP2 was the longest-serving pope of modern times, meaning that a lot of the character of modern Catholicism was shaped by his leadership. He was mostly conservative theologically. He basically accepted the reforms to Catholic teachings that had been made during the 1960s and didn't really want to push things forward or backwards. This included continuing to maintain very socially conservative positions on things like abortion and birth control and homosexuality, even as these views were becoming more and more unpopular in the secular world. That said, a lot of these opinions were still fairly mainstream among Catholics, and the Pope's reputation was ultimately more associated with the amount of international travel and advocacy he did. Born in Poland, he was particularly known for speaking out against the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and is often considered like the top Christian leader of the Cold War. Near the end of his 26-year reign, the Pope had gotten really frail and wasn't able to do much, and the sad and even pathetic spectacle of his final years helped foster a growing consensus that popes should retire rather than serve until death. Number 7, Manuel Noriega, dictator of Panama from 1983 to 1990. There was a brief moment when General Noriega was one of the most infamous men in the world, and his chaotic rule of Panama led to a short war with the United States. Noriega is probably one of the most cynical world leaders in history. His life was just a giant game of exploiting anyone around him in any way he he could to gain power and wealth. He sold secrets to the Americans for many years, but then he was also selling secrets to the communists. In what was probably his greatest undoing, he had all of these deals with Latin American drug lords, wherein he allowed them to use his country as a base for smuggling cocaine into Miami in exchange for a cut of the profits. In 1989, Noriega's goon squad had begun assaulting American soldiers in Panama, of which there were a lot at the time, because in those days, the US still controlled the Panama Canal. This provoked the US under George H.W. Bush to invade Panama and capture Noriega, which they did, and the early 90s saw him face a high-profile trial in Florida. He tried to humiliate the Americans for being his former backers, but was ultimately convicted. Number 8, Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany from 1982 to 1998. Kohl was actually initially just the Chancellor of West Germany, but in the crowning glory of his political career, he successfully orchestrated the merger of East Germany and West Germany in 1990, and was then elected the first Chancellor of a united German Republic a few months later. As head of the United Germany, he worked closely with France to create the 1992 agreement that established the modern European Union, and is accordingly considered one of the founding fathers of the EU. Kohl is a conservative who is sometimes lumped in with other leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in representing the Western world's turn towards conservatism in the 1980s. The slow consolidation of so much economic and political power in the hands of a single right-wing German did foster some paranoia, but Kohl's deep passion for the democratic political and economic integration of Europe ultimately helped give him a reputation as one of the great peacemakers of the 20th century. Sometimes to the point of arrogance. I know in retirement he was sometimes fond of talking about my Europe. Number 9, Yasser Arafat, president of the Palestinian government from 1994 to 2004. The Palestinians are, of course, an Arab people who live in the lands of what is today Israel, and Arafat was originally head of a terrorist group that advocated destroying Israel and creating a liberated Palestinian nation in its place. In some parts of the world, he was seen as a principled freedom fighter, but the acts of anti-Semitic violence his group was associated with made him deeply unpopular in the West. In the 1990s, he mellowed out a lot, however, and promoted the idea of a so-called two-state solution. He won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 for helping negotiate the Oslo Accords, which created a semi-sovereign Palestinian government that accepted the existence of Israel, but was also expected to someday run an independent Palestinian nation as well. But I think it is now relatively uncontroversial to say that Arafat did not run that Palestinian government particularly well, and instead presided over a lot of corruption and lackluster social services, while violence between Palestinian terrorists and the Israeli military continued to cause death and suffering on both sides. Today, an independent Palestine seems as far off as ever, and should that day ever come, I do wonder how much credit Arafat will be given for it. Number 10, Fidel Castro, ruler of Cuba from 1959 to 2011. Coming to power in a dramatic 1959 coup, Castro was the first guerrilla revolutionary type to take over a third world country. As author James Park puts it in his excellent book, Icons, this made him a heartthrob for revolutionaries everywhere. He was aggressively anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-American, and the way he dressed and spoke and the causes he supported and opposed made him one of the world's leading symbols of resistance to the modern bourgeois world order. Though many on the left found him a romantic and even heroic figure for resisting America's historic control of Cuba, people on the right have always loathed him and accused his government of using a seductive revolutionary aesthetic to mask a dreary, run-of-the-mill Latin American dictatorship. Cuba did boast some positive quality of life metrics under his regime, but by the time he finally stepped down, it wasn't uncommon to argue that he hadn't really accomplished that much, despite ruling the island for over half a century. Number 11, Kiichi Miyazawa, Prime Minister of Japan from 1991 to 1993. It is sometimes difficult to compare Japanese prime ministers to the leaders of other countries just because it is fairly traditional in Japan for prime ministers to only serve for like a year or two. But Japan's political culture is also unique in that a prime minister might achieve much of their relevance before or even after they held the top job. Ichi Miyazawa, for instance, was once described by the New York Times as the man who helped guide Japan from post-war ruin to economic superpower on the basis of what he did while holding a nearly unbroken string of leading government jobs from the 1960s to the early 2000s, including Minister of Trade, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and yes, Prime Minister as well. And in these jobs, he was always animated by the same core goals and values, making Japan a prosperous country through a strong market economy, strong codependent trade relationships with Asia and the West, and a stable, paternalistic, and consensus-driven political system that was always headed by his political party, of course. Number 12, Muammar Gadhafi, leader of Libya from 1969 to 2011. Colonel Gadhafi was one of the 20th century's most flamboyant dictators and was one of the great villains in the eyes of the Western world. In addition to the extreme and eccentric tyranny he imposed on Libya, he was a sponsor of terrorists all over the planet, from Chad to Germany to Argentina to Ireland. Ronald Reagan famously called him the mad dog of the Middle East, and there was a time when terrorists in Hollywood movies would often be depicted as Libyans. Gadhafi often came off as a bit of a Hollywood character himself, with his garish outfits and all-female bodyguards and long, rambling speeches preaching the principles of his ever-changing philosophy. Gadhafi came to power in his 20s and was one of the longest-serving dictators in history, ruling Libya for over 40 years. He was eventually overthrown and killed in 2011 following NATO bombing raids in response to his unprecedented crackdown on civilian protesters. Number 13, Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister of Canada from 1984 to 1993. Mulroney, much like Helmut Kohl, was another one of several conservative leaders who rose to power in the West during the 1980s. His election was very much seen as a rejection of the long era of left-wing rule that preceded him under the famous Pierre Elliott Trudeau. His administration was very personally and philosophically close with that of Ronald Reagan in the United States, and Mulroney was seen as a very pro-American leader by Canadian standards overall, and the leading advocate for the continent-wide free trade deal that would eventually become NAFTA. Like many Canadian leaders of his time, Mulroney was also preoccupied with trying to resolve tensions with the French-Canadian province of Quebec, where nationalist sentiment had been steadily growing. He twice tried to dramatically rewrite the Canadian Constitution to rework the Canadian Federation in a way that would give new powers to the province, but both attempts failed, and the political damage his party suffered in the aftermath brought global attention to the fact that this whole difficult business of sorting out relations with Quebec seemed destined to remain one of Canada's defining dramas. Number 14, Benazir Bhutto, Prime Minister of Pakistan from 1988 to 1990, and then 1993 to 1996. So the world had high hopes for Mrs. Bhutto, the first woman elected Prime Minister of Pakistan, or indeed any majority Muslim country. I would say that her gender, her Western education, and frankly, her looks made a lot of outsiders assume that she was sincere in her stated intentions to clean up Pakistan and transform it into a functional democracy, but in practice, none of this happened. Like most female leaders of that time, Bhutto was the daughter of an ex-prime minister, a man who had been executed by the military government that overthrew him. When free elections were finally held in 1988, she, the daughter of the supposed martyr of democracy, was elected to power, but her government was notoriously corrupt, incompetent, and nepotistic. It's also been blamed for boosting the rising Taliban movement in Afghanistan, which the Pakistanis believed would protect them from India. When the Pakistani military once again took over in 1999, Bhutto was exiled and was able to rebuild her international brand as the savior of democracy. And who knows, maybe she would have been if she had been able to get elected again. But she was assassinated in 2007 and her legend was cut short. And lastly, number 15, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq from the 1970s to 2003. According to this excellent book, The Great Big Book of Horrible Things by Matthew White, Saddam Hussein was one of the most murderous dictators of the 20th century, responsible for at least 1 million deaths. In 1980, he instigated a brutal war with Iran, and he was in charge when Iraq staged its 1990 invasion of Kuwait that we mentioned earlier. Saddam's political enemies within Iraq, meanwhile, were tortured and killed in massive numbers, and he notoriously used chemical weapons against Iraqi Kurds in 1988. I remember when I was a kid, Saddam was considered an almost satanic figure, very much the Hitler of our time, albeit one that the Western world didn't really seem to have that much trouble keeping in line through periodic bombings and so forth. The evil of his government has now been mostly overshadowed by the circumstances of his downfall, however, namely the 2003 invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush. We won't get into all of that now, but it's been said that Bush's invasion would have never enjoyed the initial public support it did had Saddam not established himself as such a despised character in the 90s. All right, so there you have it, 15 key world leaders from the early 1990s. If you have any thoughts or opinions or added insights about any of the leaders that we've talked about today, which I am sure you do, please let me know in the comments. And who would you add to this little pantheon? Also, let me know if you'd like to see me do another core knowledge video like this one on some other topic. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.